The first letter arrived on a Tuesday. A neatly folded piece of paper stuffed into the mailbox, its pristine white surface glaring under the early morning sun. The words "Notice of Violation" were printed in bold black letters at the top. I had gotten them before, once or twice, some minor infractions. I wasn't the best at following all the HOA rules. Who could be? But this one felt different. This one felt personal. I unfolded the paper and read the ridiculousness. Apparently my barn's gate wasn't the correct shade of brown. I'd painted it the same color I had for the last 20 years. I'd inherited this ranch from my grandfather, and it had been in the family for generations. The gate had been this color for longer than the HOA had existed, yet here it was, a violation. I rubbed my temples. It was the middle of harvest season, and now I had to repaint a perfectly fine gate to suit some power-hungry middle-aged woman's whims. I tossed the letter on the kitchen table and tried to forget about it as I walked back out to the field, but it gnawed at me. The HOA had always been a nuisance, sure, but the recent developments were starting to irritate me more. A new luxury. Housing development had been pushed right to the edge of my property. Big mansions, landscaped lawns, and no regard for the land that had been my family's for generations. There, at the end of the road, I could see the shiny new homes taking shape. They were too close. Far too close. The next one over, I knew, would be smack on top of the line my grandfather had carefully marked decades ago. But I had never imagined the HOA had the power to do more than dictate how many tree branches hung over the sidewalk or how high your grass could get. I noticed the figure standing at the corner of the property, Carolyn Drake, the HOA president. Mid-50s, sharp features and a permanent look of superiority. She was standing near the construction site, clipboard in hand, dictating something to one of the workers. I couldn't hear her from here, but she didn't need to speak for me to know she was causing trouble. I turned my attention back to my field, but there was no escaping her influence. She'd been relentless, sending letter after letter with absurd complaints. My cows were too loud. My tractor was too old. My garden looked disorganized. She was using her position to nitpick every detail of my life, and I was starting to feel it, like a tightening knot in my chest. As I mulled over my options, I heard the whine of an engine getting louder. A black SUV came into view, crawling slowly up the dirt road. I recognized the vehicle. It was Carolyn's. She was on her way to confront me. I braced myself. A confrontation was inevitable. The truck stopped just short of the gate. The engine clicked off, and the woman herself climbed out, clipboard still in hand, wearing that same smug look she always did when she was about to enforce something. "Morning, Jack," Carolyn called out, her voice far too chipper considering the tension hanging between us. "I see you got my letter." I didn't reply immediately, simply staring at her. My gaze shifted to the construction site behind her. "Those homes are getting awful close to my property line." She didn't flinch. "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding," she said, her tone condescending, as though she had all the time in the world to explain it to a simple farmer like me. "We're just following procedure, you know." "Procedure?" I asked, my voice sharpening. "I don't think you understand the procedure. This land's been in my family for generations. Carolyn, it doesn't belong to your little development." She smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "You'll have to take that up with the board. I've already submitted the plan, and we've been following the rules. You wouldn't want to make things harder for your neighbors, would you?" I felt my blood run cold. It was always the same tactic: divide and conquer. She knew my neighbors. Weren't all that fond of me. Ranchers and farmers rarely mingled well with suburbanites. "I'll take it up with whoever I need to," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But this isn't over." "Oh, I'm sure it's not," she said, her smile never wavering. "I'll be sending over more letters, of course. You know, just to keep you informed." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back to her SUV, clipboard still firmly in hand. I stood there, watching her go, already dreading the next letter, the next fine, the next intrusion into my life. I didn't know how or why she thought she could get away with it, but something told me this was just the beginning. The next few days passed in a haze of annoyance. Letters piled up, each one more ridiculous than the last. Fines for everything from the angle of my porch light to the angle of the fence posts. Carolyn didn't stop, and neither did her control over the HOA board. It wasn't long before I realized something more insidious was happening. The development behind me wasn't just encroaching on my land, it was taking it. I spent hours in the county records office, tracing the deeds, the surveys, the property lines. That's when I found it. The original documents from my grandfather, dated and signed, clearly showing that the development had no claim to the land they were building on. I was sitting on a gold mine, but I didn't know it yet. What I did know was that Carolyn had taken the first step toward making this personal. And now I had a choice to make. Could I let this continue? Or was I ready to face her head-on? Before I could decide, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. I answered it. "Mr. Thornton, this is Mark Hayes. I'm a lawyer in town and I've been following the situation with the HOA. I felt a flicker of hope. "We need to talk," he said. And suddenly, the scales tipped. The door to Carolyn's SUV slammed shut with a finality that echoed in my bones. I knew it wasn't over, but I also knew I wasn't going to let her win. Not this time. The stage was set, but who would come out on top? Got it. Here's part 2. Exactly 4,000 characters long, continuing the high-stakes tension with a major reveal at the end. The lawyer, Mark Hayes, met me at a diner just off the main road, a place where ranchers and old-timers gathered for coffee there. Conversations thick with talk of weather and cattle prices. He was younger than I expected, mid-30s maybe, dressed in a dark suit that didn't quite belong here. But his eyes, sharp, calculating, told me he wasn't someone to be underestimated. Slid into the booth across from him. "You said you've been following the situation," I said, cutting straight to it. Mark nodded, sipping his coffee. "I have. Carolyn Drake isn't just running a homeowners association, she's orchestrating a land grab." I leaned back, arms crossed. "Explain." He pulled out a folder and spread some documents across the table. "Carolyn's been manipulating HOA regulations for years, targeting homeowners who push back, drowning them in fines and violations until they're forced to sell. Then, mysteriously, those properties end up in the hands of developers at a fraction of their worth." I picked up one of the papers, skimming it. The names on the deeds were familiar, neighbors who had moved suddenly, claiming they were fed up with the rules. "This can't be legal," I muttered. "It isn't, but it's hard to prove outright fraud when everything is hidden behind HOA bylaws, legalese and technicalities. And she's been careful. Every sale looks voluntary, on paper." I frowned, processing. "So why come to me?" Mark leaned in. "Because your situation is different. She's not just harassing you, she's actively stealing your land. And she's getting desperate." I exhaled slowly. "Desperate people make mistakes." Mark smiled slightly. "Exactly. If we can force her into a corner, we might be able to expose her." I drummed my fingers against the table. "What's our first move?" Mark flipped through his papers. "Before we do anything drastic, we need to confirm your claim. I need to see those original property surveys your grandfather left behind." I nodded. "I've got them at the ranch." Mark slid the folder back into his briefcase. "Then let's go." "Bye." The time we pulled up to my property, the sun had dipped low, casting a burnt orange glow across the fields. I parked next to the barn and hopped out, but as I stepped toward the house, something caught my eye, a white slip of paper pinned to my front door. I pulled it off, already knowing who it was from. Final notice. Failure to comply will result in escalated action. Carolyn Drake, HOA President. I crumpled it in my fist. Mark glanced over. She's pushing hard. Too hard, I muttered. Inside, I pulled the old property surveys from my grandfather's desk, yellowed papers, edges curled with time. Mark spread them out over the dining table, tracing the lines with his fingers. "This is solid," he murmured. "These surveys prove the land your grandfather left behind extends past where they're building. It's not just a small dispute. They're well into your property." I exhaled, a sharp laugh escaping. "They're building a damn mansion on my land." Mark's expression darkened. "They are, and Carolyn knows it." Before I could respond, headlights swept across the window. A car pulled up the dirt road fast, throwing gravel as it skidded to a stop. I knew that SUV, Carolyn Drake. I met Mark's eyes. "Looks like we won't have to wait to push her into a corner." She stepped out of the vehicle with a carefully practiced air of authority, her posture straight, hands folded over that ever-present clipboard. The porch light cast long shadows across her face, sharpening her expression into something nearly inhuman. "Evening, Jack," she called out, casual as ever. I stepped off the porch. "What do you want, Carolyn?" She let out a breathy, exaggerated sigh. "I was hoping we could have a civil discussion, but you haven't been very cooperative." I glanced at Mark, who had silently positioned himself near the porch. He wasn't saying anything, but he was watching, analyzing. Carolyn's eyes flicked to him. "Who's your friend?" I crossed my arms. "You're on my land, Carolyn. You don't get to ask questions." Her expression didn't change, but I saw something tighten in her jaw. "I came to warn you," she said, her voice slipping into something dangerously close to a threat. "You're racking up a lot of fines, a lot of infractions. Non-compliance will have consequences." I let out a slow exhale, forcing myself to stay calm. "And what exactly does that mean?" Her smile was thin. "It means that the HOA has the legal right to place a lien on your property. And once we do, well, unpaid debts can lead to foreclosure." There it was. She wasn't just trying to force me to comply. She was trying to take everything. I took a step forward, lowering my voice. "You don't own this land, Carolyn, and you sure as hell don't control me." She tilted her head, watching me like she had already won. "I think you'll find that laws are a tricky thing, and you're just one man against an entire board." I felt my fingers curl into fists, but Mark spoke. Before I could. "You're making a mistake," he said calmly. Carolyn turned to him. "Oh, and who are you to say that?" Mark smiled, slow and deliberate. "A lawyer, one who knows exactly how to bury corrupt HOA boards." For the first time, Carolyn hesitated. Mark continued. "See, you've gotten away with this for years because no one has pushed back. You prey on people who don't know the system. But Jack isn't one of them, and neither am I." Carolyn's nostrils flared. "You think you can win this? You have no idea how deep this goes." Mark's smile didn't waver. "Neither do you." A beat of silence stretched between them, the air thick with unspoken threats. Then Carolyn exhaled, sharply. "Enjoy your evening," she said, spinning on her heel. The SUV door slammed shut and she peeled out, tires kicking up dust as she sped back toward the development. I let out a slow breath. Mark turned to me. "She's scared." "Not scared enough," I muttered. I looked down at the crumpled notice in my hand, then back at the property surveys on the table. It wasn't just a fight for my land anymore. It was war. And Carolyn Drake had just made the biggest mistake of her life. But the real bombshell came the next morning when I found a new letter in my mailbox. But this one wasn't from the HOA, it was from a whistleblower, and it had Carolyn's name all over it. The envelope was plain, no return address. Just my name scrawled in jittery black ink. I tore it open, heart thudding. Inside was a stack of photocopied documents and a single note typed, "You don't know me, but you need to see this. Carolyn Drake has been falsifying HOA records and rigging votes to push her developments. Look at the attached files. She's not just after your land. She's covering something up." I flipped through the pages. Bank transfers, fake signatures, meeting minutes that had never actually happened. A slow, cold realization crept up my spine. Carolyn wasn't just abusing HOA power. She was running a full-scale racket, and someone on the inside had just handed me the proof. Mark and I sat in my kitchen, documents spread across the table. The old wood creaked under the weight of our conversation. "This is big," Mark murmured, flipping through the pages. "Bigger than I thought." "She's forging." "Votes?" I asked. He nodded, jaw tight. "It looks like she's been stacking the HOA board with people in her pocket. Votes rigged in her favor, any opposition pushed out. It's how she gets away with these land deals. No oversight." I let out a slow breath, running a hand through my hair. How the hell did she think no one would notice? Mark smirked. "Because up until now, no one's had a reason to look." He tapped the stack of documents. "But this changes everything. This isn't just about your land anymore. If we prove this, she's done." I exhaled, staring at the mess of paperwork. "We need to figure out who sent this." Mark tapped a finger on the note. "Someone on the inside. Someone who's scared. And that means Carolyn is more vulnerable than she's letting on." I leaned back, thinking, if she had people turning on her, she was slipping. But the thing about cornered animals? They lash out, and Carolyn Drake was about to get desperate. By mid-afternoon, I found out just how desperate. A tow truck was in my driveway, and it was hauling my tractor. "What the hell is this?" I barked, storming down the porch. A guy in a reflective vest looked up, expression flat. "Order from the HOA. Vehicle violation." "It's a damn tractor. It's my equipment." He shrugged. "HOA claims it's a hazard. Said it was abandoned machinery." My blood boiled. "Put it down." "Can't do that," he said, "unless you take it up with the HOA." I clenched my fists. This was Carolyn. She was trying to push me over the edge, get me to react. Make a mistake. Not happening. I pulled out my phone and dialed Mark. "You're on speaker," I said as soon as he answered. The tow guy glanced up, warily. "This is illegal," Mark said, voice crisp, sharp. "HOAs don't have jurisdiction over commercial farming equipment. I suggest you release the property before we press charges for unlawful seizure." The tow guy paled. "Look, man, I just got a call to pick it up. And now you're getting a call to put it back down," Mark interrupted. "Unless you want to be personally liable for damages." The guy hesitated. Then, finally, he sighed and started lowering the tractor. "Good choice," Mark muttered. I hung up and watched as the tow truck pulled away. I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt the noose tightening. Carolyn wasn't backing down. She was escalating, and I had a feeling this was just the beginning. That night, the power went out, not just in my house, across the entire farm. I checked the breakers. Nothing tripped. Then I went outside and saw the problem. The wires from the power pole had been cut, not chewed by animals, not damaged by weather. Cut, deliberately. A cold rage settled in my gut. This wasn't just HOA fines and bureaucratic games anymore. This was sabotage. I grabbed my phone, snapped pictures, and called the sheriff. By the time they arrived, I was standing in the dark, flashlight beam catching the severed cables. The deputy, a burly man with tired eyes, scratched his chin. "You got enemies, Jack?" I let out a dry laugh. "One." He exhaled through his nose. "No cameras out here?" "No." He looked at the wires again, then back at me. "I'll file a report, but without witnesses." He trailed off. Got the message. Carolyn had just sent a warning, and law enforcement wasn't going to stop her. I clenched my jaw. "Thanks, deputy." He gave me a long look, then nodded and headed back to his cruiser. I stood in the dark for a long time after. He left. Then I pulled out my phone and called Mark. "We need to move," I said as soon as he answered. There was a pause. Agreed. The next morning, Carolyn made her boldest move yet. An official eviction notice was taped to my front door. Due to continued non-compliance with HOA regulations and unpaid fines, the property is subject to repossession. Failure to vacate will result in legal action. Signed, Carolyn Drake. I felt something deep in my chest snap. She had crossed a line. She wasn't just trying to bully me, she was trying to erase me. But as I stood there, fingers tightening around the paper, a single thought cut through the haze of rage. She had overplayed her hand, and she didn't even know it yet. I turned, grabbed my keys, and drove straight to town, to the county recorder's office, to find the one document that would end her. I walked in, heart pounding, and strode up to the counter. The clerk barely looked up. "Can I help you?" "I need access to the original property records for Thornton Ranch," I said. "Everything dating back to my grandfather." She frowned. "That's old. Might take a bit to pull up." Then she paused, flipped through the system, and her face changed. "What is it?" I asked, stomach twisting. She hesitated. Then she turned the screen toward me, and my blood ran cold. "The records for Thornton Ranch," she said carefully. "They're missing." I stared at the clerk, willing myself to have misheard her. "Missing?" I repeated, voice slow, deliberate. She turned the screen back to herself, clicking through a few more menus as if the records might magically reappear. "They're not in the system," she said. "No recent scans, no digitized copies, and—" She hesitated, her brows furrowing. "And?" I pressed. She exhaled. "No paper records either. It's like they were never filed." A cold weight settled in my chest. That wasn't possible. I had seen those records, my grandfather's original surveys, his deeds, his signatures. I had them at the ranch, but official records don't just disappear, not unless someone wants them. Gone. I gritted my teeth. Carolyn. She was trying to wipe me off the map, literally. I turned on my heel, already dialing Mark. He picked up on the first ring. "They erased the records," I said, a beat of silence. Then, "What?" I pushed through the doors, stepping into the midday heat. "The official records for my land are gone, not lost, erased, like I never owned it to begin with." I heard Mark curse, under his breath. "They're trying to rewrite history. Without those records, they can claim your land was always part of the HOA development." I clenched my jaw. "They can try." Another pause. "Where are you now?" "County office. Stay put. I'm on my way." I hung up and stood there, fists clenched. Carolyn had just pulled her boldest stunt yet. And she wasn't done, because when I got back to my truck, another envelope was waiting for me, tucked neatly under the windshield wiper, a new notice of immediate eviction. By the time Mark arrived, I had read it twice. "This is illegal," he muttered, scanning the letter. "Even if they wiped the records, they can't just evict you without due process. This isn't how it works." I let out a bitter laugh. "Since when has that stopped Carolyn? Mark flipped the paper over, eyes narrowing. This was hand-delivered. No official postage, no legal processing. She's making it look official, but it's all bluff. I glanced at him. You sure about that? His expression hardened. She's desperate. And when desperate people start fabricating legal threats, they're running out of options. A flicker of hope sparked in my gut. She was running out of options. We just had to push her over the edge. That night, I barely slept. Every noise outside made my skin crawl. I half expected another power outage, another act of sabotage. But Carolyn was playing a different game now, a psychological one. And the next morning, she went for the kill. The sheriff showed up at my property just after sunrise. I was hauling feed to the cattle when I heard the crunch of tires on the dirt road. 2 patrol cars. Lights flashing, no sirens. I set the feed bucket down and wiped my hands as the sheriff himself stepped out. Sheriff Davis. Older guy, built like an oak tree, with a mustache that looked like it had seen more years than I had. He took off his sunglasses. Jack, I nodded. Sheriff, he sighed. We got a complaint from the HOA. Shocker, I muttered. What is it this time? Davis shifted, clearly uncomfortable. They're claiming you're unlawfully occupying land that doesn't belong to you. They want you removed. I exhaled through my nose. And do you believe that? His jaw tightened. Jack, you know how this works. If they have paperwork, I have to follow up. I crossed my arms. They don't have paperwork. They have forged paperwork. Davis rubbed his temple. Listen, you and I both know Carolyn Drake is a piece of work. But if the county records don't show your ownership, I have the original property surveys, I cut in, signed by my grandfather. You saw them when I settled the estate. Davis hesitated. Didn't. You, I pressed. Something flickered in his eyes. He had seen them, but now, officially, they didn't exist. Jack, he said slowly, I can stall this, but I need something solid. You got a lawyer? Right here, Mark said, stepping out from the porch. Davis nodded, but his expression was grim. Then get moving, because Carolyn's playing dirty, and if you don't fight back fast, she'll have the courts backing her before you can blink. Noon, we were back at the county office. Mark had called in a favor with a judge he knew, filing an immediate injunction against any eviction. It wouldn't hold forever, but it bought us time. We needed proof, real proof, and that meant going deeper. Mark leaned over the desk, voice low. There's one place they can't erase records from. I frowned. Where? He slid me a piece of paper. An address. The county archives. Physical storage. I stared at him. You think they missed something? Mark smirked. I think they're sloppy, and I think Carolyn is way too confident. I exhaled, grabbing my keys. Then let's dig. The county. Archives were a dusty maze of metal shelves, stretching back for decades. We spent hours combing through old property maps, handwritten surveys, faded deeds, and then Jack. Mark's voice was sharp, urgent. I turned to see him holding a folder, a very old, very official-looking folder. I stepped closer, heart hammering. He opened it, and there, clear as day, were the original records. Thornton Ranch, established 1937. Ownership history intact. My grandfather's name. My father's. Mine. It was real, indisputable. And then I saw something else, a document tucked behind the survey maps, a contract signed by Carolyn Drake. Dated 2 weeks ago. I stared, my brain catching up with what I was seeing. Mark let out a low whistle. Well, would you look at that? I swallowed hard. She hadn't just erased the records. She had tried to claim the land for herself. Not for the HOA, for her. And now I had the proof. I looked up at Mark, my grip tightening on the papers. It's over, I said, but Mark only smirked. "Not yet," he murmured. "We're going to make sure she goes down hard." Carolyn had spent years making people believe she was untouchable. She built her kingdom brick by brick, rule by rule, lie by lie. She used fear as a weapon, wielding HOA bylaws like a dictator's decree. But she had made one fatal mistake. She had underestimated me. She had underestimated us. Mark and I left the county archives with the original records in hand. The proof that not only had Carolyn erased my land's history, but she had tried to steal it outright. This wasn't just an HOA overreach. This was fraud, grand-scale fraud. And now, we had everything we needed to burn her little empire to the ground. We didn't go to the police. Not yet. No, Carolyn had made a show of humiliating me, of forcing my back against the wall in front of the entire community. And now, I was going to return the favor. The emergency HOA meeting was set for that evening. Carolyn had called it herself, thinking she was about to finalize my eviction, stamp my name out of existence, and parade her victory in front of her loyal board members. She had no idea what was coming. I walked into that meeting hall like a man carrying dynamite. Mark was at my side, briefcase in hand. The room was packed. Homeowners, board members, developers, people who had spent years bending to Carolyn's will. People who had been fined, bullied, manipulated. Some were afraid. Some were resentful. All of them were about to witness the moment the Queen lost her crown. Carolyn sat at the front of the hall, smiling like she already knew she had won. She thrived on this. On the theatrics, the illusion of power. She tapped her gavel lightly. "Let's get started." I didn't sit down, neither did Mark. She frowned slightly. "Jack, if you'd like to say a few words before we move forward with—" "I'm not here to talk," I said, my voice carrying across the room. I reached into my bag, pulled out the thick folder of documents, and slammed it onto the table. The sound echoed through the silent hall. Carolyn's smirk twitched. "What's this?" she asked, her voice cool, but I could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. Mark leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "That," he said slowly, "is every record you tried to erase." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I flipped, opened the folder, turning the documents toward the homeowners. Thornton Ranch, original property lines, deeds, surveyor reports, all proving that the land you're trying to steal has belonged to my family for generations. Carolyn's expression didn't change. Not yet. She had spent too long in control to crack that easily. "These could be fabricated," she said, her tone sharp, cutting. "Where's the county's official—" Mark slid another document forward, a copy of the fraudulent land transfer, the one with her name on it, signed. 2 weeks ago. Her face finally lost color. "Ah," Mark said, voice casual. "That's the problem, isn't it? You didn't just erase the records. You tried to claim the land for yourself." A collective inhale rippled through the room. Carolyn's grip on the table tightened. "This is ridiculous." "No, what's ridiculous," I said, "is that you thought you could erase a man's entire history and walk away unscathed." She pushed back from her chair. "This meeting is adjourned." "No," Mark said smoothly. "It's not." He turned to the crowd, voice crisp, legal. "Ladies and gentlemen, Carolyn Drake has abused her power for years. She has forged documents, illegally seized properties, manipulated HOA votes, and silenced opposition. What she did to Jack, she's done to dozens of you." Another wave of murmurs, faces turning, whispering, doubt creeping into her supporters' eyes. And then the shouting began. "This happened to me. She fined me for months until I sold my house for pennies. She told me it was HOA policy. I didn't even know I had a choice. The dam broke. People were on their feet. Anger, realization, betrayal crashing through the room. Carolyn stood frozen. I saw it happen. The exact moment she realized she wasn't in control anymore. She had lost. And then, as if fate had a sense of humor, the double doors swung open. Sheriff Davis walked in. Behind him, 2 county investigators. The room fell silent. Carolyn whipped around. "What?" Davis held up a warrant. "Carolyn Drake, you are under investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and falsification of government documents." Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. "This is a mistake," she hissed. "No," I said. The mistake was thinking no one would ever fight back. And with every eye in the room on her, Carolyn Drake was led out in handcuffs. The fallout was glorious. The HOA crumbled. Carolyn's board members turned on her, throwing her under the bus to save themselves. My land, mine, officially, unshakably. But more than that, the community changed. People who had been too afraid to speak started coming forward. The HOA was dismantled. In its place, a new association was formed, one that protected homeowners, not exploited them. It took months, but when the dust settled, the neighborhood wasn't a dictatorship anymore. It was free. And Carolyn, well, turns out HOA presidents don't fare too well when they steal land and commit fraud. Last I heard, she had traded her clipboard for a prison uniform. Poetic justice. And me? I kept my ranch, my home, my history, because some things aren't for sale. And no self-righteous bureaucratic dictator was ever going to take that from me. I stepped out onto my porch, watching the sun set over the land that was mine. A breeze rustled through the trees, quiet, peaceful, the way it should have been all along, the way it would stay.